Those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Anjali Comment.
Welcome, everyone. President Obama is speaking before a joint session of Congress Tuesday night in what is being described as the first State of the Union address of his presidency. While the economy is expected to dominate the agenda, Obama will also talk about his top foreign policy initiative, the war in Afghanistan. Last week, Obama ordered an additional 17,000 U.S. combat troops to Afghanistan. The new deployments will begin in May and increase the U.S. occupation force to 55,000. Another 32,000 non-U.S. NATO troops are also in Afghanistan, although at a meeting in Poland last week, NATO allies seemed reluctant to contribute more than a few hundred new combat troops to Afghanistan. The top U.S. commander, General David McKiernan in Afghanistan, welcomed Obama's announcement.
I am very delighted with the President's decision yesterday to send additional U.S. forces to reinforce our efforts in Afghanistan. I will use most of those forces in the southern part of Afghanistan, an area where we do not have sufficient security presence, an area that has deteriorated somewhat, an area where we need persistent security presence in order to fight a counterinsurgency and to shape, clear, hold, and build in support of rapidly developing Afghan capacity.
General McKiernan added later that at least another 10,000 troops will be needed beyond the president's call for 17,000 more troops. He said 60,000 U.S. troops would have to remain in Afghanistan for the next 3 to 4 years. Meanwhile, the U.S. military admitted on Saturday that a recent missile strike in western Afghanistan killed a majority of civilians. Last Tuesday's bombs hit the tents of nomads where about 100 families lived. This is Kareem Khan, a resident of the area.
It was 4 in the morning when the aircraft started bombing, and people were asleep. 13 people from the tents and 3 other visitors were killed.
The U.S. had originally said the strikes had killed 15 insurgents, but conducted an investigation following Afghan outrage over the attack. The U.S. military now admits that 13 of the 16 killed in the strike were civilians.
News of the strike came as the UN said Afghan civilian casualties jumped by nearly 40% last year. U.S.-led forces were responsible for nearly 40% of the deaths, killing 828 people out of a reported 2,100 casualties. Last week also marked the 20th anniversary of the Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan after an occupation that lasted 10 years and was followed shortly thereafter by the collapse of the Soviet Union. Today, nearly 7.5 years into the U.S.-led invasion and occupation of Afghanistan, we host a discussion on the U.S. role there, past, present, and future. We're joined by several guests throughout the hour. We're going to start, though, with Anand Gopal, the Afghanistan correspondent for the Christian Science Monitor. He joins us on the line from Kabul. Welcome to Democracy Now!, Anand. Tomorrow, President Obama will address a joint session of Congress. He'll be talking about the economy. He'll also be talking about Afghanistan. Can you talk about the significance of the surge in Afghanistan?
Well, as you mentioned in the opening, the violence has been increasing here every year for the last few years. So a lot of people here in Afghanistan feel that we're at a critical juncture. We're at a point where large parts of the countryside are not under the control of the Afghan government or the international forces, and without a drastic policy change, that things might tip over the edge. So the surge is something that's being debated widely here.
Anand Gopal, what's been the reaction inside Afghanistan to the rising civilian casualties?
This is something that's weighing heavily on the minds of Afghans everywhere, and especially in those areas where the fighting is happening. This is really bringing a lot of villagers to question whether they want more troops in their areas. A lot of Afghans that I speak to in these southern areas where the fighting's been happening say that if you bring more troops, it's going to mean more civilian casualties. It'll mean more of these night raids, which have been deeply unpopular amongst Afghans. And also, there's a problem where whenever American soldiers go into a village and then leave, the Taliban comes and attacks that village. So a lot of villagers feel that they're sort of being attacked on all sides here, and don't view the injection of more troops as necessarily a solution to that.
Anand Gopal, can you explain how much of Afghanistan is under control of the Afghan government and how the Taliban, after being routed in 2001, is once again a powerful force in the country?
The latest U.S. National Intelligence estimate about Afghanistan that covered this question estimated that about 10% of the country is under the control of the Afghan government. And this was about 8 months ago, and I would suspect that that number's gone even less since then. And the way it's worked is most of the small towns and urban areas are under the control of the Afghan government, but most of the rural areas, which is where the majority of people live here, are not under the control of the government. They're either under the control of the Taliban or under the control of various warlords and militias. And the Afghan countryside has been extremely chaotic and lawless for many years, and so the Taliban kind of rode back into power on a platform of law and order, saying that the Afghan government is not doing its job of keeping out criminals and then providing security. So we're going to come in here and install Sharia law and make this place safe from criminals and bandits.
Anand Gopal, Vice President Biden recently met with President Hamid Karzai. There's been a clear shift of pulling support from Karzai by the U.S. government. I believe they were in the middle of a meal and Biden just got up and left. Can you talk about Hamid Karzai's power right now, elections that are supposed to be coming up? His brother, Hamid Karzai's brother, the allegation that he is a drug dealer, a drug runner in Afghanistan, and what future there is for the man who's been the U.S. representative in Afghanistan for quite a long time now.
Karzai's popularity here is at an all-time low. He's associated with a government that's viewed as anywhere between predatory and ineffective. And the Afghan government has not been able to deliver on the many promises over the last few years, and so Afghans are holding Karzai responsible for this. And as his power is sort of been eroding here, he's lashed out against the Americans and he's been very vocal in his criticism of the civilian casualties. And I think this is one of the reasons why the U.S. administration is kind of thinking about cutting him loose, because of his pretty open and demonstrative criticisms of U.S. policy here. With that being said, there is an election coming up in the next few months, and there isn't a clear-cut alternative to Karzai. Karzai has been able to build a sort of a network, a patronage network over the course of the last few years of important tribal leaders and other such people. And there's nobody else in Afghanistan at the moment who has a sort of national name that Karzai does. So he's in an interesting bind where he's very unpopular, but at the same time isn't really opposed by any significant figure.
And Anand Gopal, the last question I want to ask you is about what are the different groups that sort of generally are thought to make up the Taliban? In this country, when we talk about forces fighting the U.S. and NATO occupation in Afghanistan, they're all generally called the Taliban. Can you give us a sense of who are the different insurgent groups in this country?
Yeah, the Taliban are sort of a catch-all phrase for 3 or 4 different groups. The one is the group that's led by Mullah Omar. These are the people that were in power back before 2001, sort of the old guard Taliban, and they make up the core of the insurgency. But they're also flanked by various other groups. One group is called the Haqqani Network. This is run by a warlord by the name of Jalaluddin Haqqani, who's based in Pakistan. He was a former American ally who's since then turned his guns on the Americans, and he's closely aligned with al-Qaeda and has been behind a lot of the suicide attacks in Kabul and other places. There's also another insurgent group led by a warlord by the name of Hekmatyar. He's also somebody who was a U.S. ally back in the 80s during the Soviet War and has since turned against the Americans. And these 3 groups are not the same, and they sort of have differing visions. Haqqani's more closely aligned to al-Qaeda, and they have more of a vision of global jihad, whereas the Mullah Omar's Taliban usually restrict their fight and their ideology to within the borders of Afghanistan.
And would you say they have been strengthened by the U.S. occupation, by the U.S. troops? Do you think their power would shift if the U.S. troops were out?
Well, certainly most of these groups, or none of these groups, had any power at all 6 or 7 years ago, and they've been able to take advantage of the widespread disillusionment that exists with the U.S. forces and with the Afghan government. And you have to remember, the U.S. has come in and made a series of promises to the Afghans, and most of those promises, such as reconstruction, jobs, development, hasn't been met. And so the Taliban and these other groups haven't made that many promises, but they've been able to point out to the Afghans, say, look, these Americans have come here and have not delivered, so you should put your allegiance to us. So, and they haven't certainly been able to capitalize on this.
Anand Gopal, thank you very much for being with us, Afghanistan correspondent for the Christian Science Monitor, speaking to us from Kabul. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. We'll continue our discussion on Afghanistan, past, present, and future in a minute.